The Incomparable series that we're starting today is a way in which you and I can experience a God that's beyond compare. And there really is no greater journey and joy than to immerse yourself in the character of God. And the discovery of the extraordinary incomparability of who God is, the God of the Bible. And this series, we're going to immerse ourselves in His character. We are going to dive right into His presence and experience the God that in the Bible is described to us as one who is beyond anything we could compare it to. When you raise little children, occasionally they ask you a question that's hard to answer about God. Why does God? Does He ever? Why didn't He? And if you like to know things and your kids pick your brain about God and they come up with a particular topic that's hard to understand, that could be frustrating because you're trying to project to your child that you know stuff. Then they ask you a question about God that you don't know and you realize you don't know everything that you feel like you should know, and sometimes the kids point it out. And sometimes when that happens, you come to the discovery that God is indescribable. It's hard to fit their little brains with the right language to help them grasp what it is that you're describing when you think of God. And the reason that that's true is because we describe things by comparing them to other things. Let me put it this way. We describe unfamiliar concepts by using familiar concepts. We refer to known things when we're trying to explain unknown things. And one example that came to my mind is that if you're going to describe what pizza tastes like, you might say pizza tastes like a hot tortilla, only a little thicker and cheesier. Is that a good description? It's not that great, is it? But well, you think of a better one then, if you are so smart. I only had a week to think about that. That's it. And then, if you didn't know what a tortilla was, you might say, well, it's like bread, only it's thinner and round, right? So I'm trying to help you. If you don't know what pizza is or tastes like, I'm trying to describe it with things that you may be familiar with. And if you have never tasted bread before, then I'm sorry. We cannot be friends. We cannot continue this conversation. But the way that people grasp concepts is to connect something unknown with something known. Does that part make sense? And so somehow, when we're comparing things to explain things, we get to the God of the Bible. And to help us understand the God of the Bible, the idea would be to connect Him to some things that we know. And we try to answer the question, how do we explain our God, the God of the Bible, especially when we're hearing a consistent message in our culture, in our secular humanist culture, and our secular humanist culture is answering the question, how do we explain the God of the Bible this way? Our culture says the God of the Bible is just one of many equal powerless gods. It's easy, actually, to compare our God to other things. Just think of any powerless God, and the secular humanist would say they're the same. They're just a kind of a construct of our neediness, and different cultures have different gods, and none of them are powerful. They're all powerless, but they're all equal. They're all the same, and it's easy to understand that. And the problem for Christians is that the prophet Isaiah, who God uses to reveal Himself to His people, he actually announces something extraordinarily different from this. The prophet Isaiah announces to Israel that God has a surprising plan to show grace to His rebellious people. And also to show His grace and glory not just to His people, but to the whole world. And He uses Israel He uses Isaiah to speak to His people in Israel, specifically the kingdom of Judah. And he addresses their unbelief in God during a pivotal event in Israel's lifetime, and he redirects their future away from blessing and towards judgment because of their rebellion. So God is revealing his plans to the Israelites through Isaiah, and he's doing it prophetically. He speaks through Isaiah to his people. And at this historic turning point, Israel is moving from independence under God's power to subservience under pagan powers. So they're independently submitted to God, and in their rebellion, they're starting to turn themselves to subservience under the unknown pagan gods of the culture that is obviously in the face of the one true God who created them. And one of God's main questions to Israel that he asks through the prophet Isaiah is this question. He says in Isaiah 40, he says, through Isaiah, God says, to whom can you compare God? To whom? So God speaks to his people through the prophet Isaiah to describe his character. And he does that by comparing himself, right? He's trying to help them understand by comparing himself to the things that they're already familiar with. Let me give you an example. He portrays himself as a cosmic carpenter. You have a picture in your mind of what a carpenter does? You have a picture in your mind of the work of a carpenter? This is what he says through Isaiah to his people. Who else has held the oceans in his hand? Who has measured off the heavens with his fingers? Who else knows the weight of the earth or has weighed the mountains and the hills on a scale? So you can imagine if you're a carpenter and this is what Isaiah is saying, you can imagine yourself going, okay, that's not wrong. I've never actually held the oceans in my hand, and when I measure things, I'm not measuring the heavens using my hands and my fingers. In fact, I get it. I don't know the weight of the earth, and obviously I can't weigh mountains and hills. We don't have a scale, so the carpenter's taken his rightful place as kind of humbly subservient and submitted to the size and magnitude of who God is. And he asks another question through Isaiah, and he asks, who advised me concerning the creation of the world? Who was my advisor? When I was creating the world, who was my advisor? Who did I turn to and say, can I run some things by you? I've got a blueprint, I've got some ideas, I want to kind of roll this out to you. And Isaiah vividly celebrates the incomparable greatness of God. He vividly celebrates the incomparableness of God. And it is greatness that can't be compared with anyone or anything. So how insignificant are the nations that Israel is at war with or submitting to or following their pagan gods? How insignificant are the nations? Isaiah's words are direct. Check this out. He says, no, for all the nations of the world are but a drop in the bucket. They are nothing more than dust on the scales. He picks up the whole earth as though it were a grain of sand. So here's God speaking to his people through Isaiah, and he says, you want to get a picture of what I'm like? When I pick up the earth and hold it in my hand, it's like having a grain of sand on my finger. All the nations of the world are but a drop in the bucket. And he goes on to say, the nations of the world are worth nothing. They have no worth. In his eyes, they count for less than nothing. They are mere emptiness and froth. Now, froth would be the picture of what you get on the seashore as the sea crashes in and kind of creates this reaction where you get to these parts of the water where it's foamy. Can you picture that? And that foam is just like bubbly air of almost nothing. And God is saying, compared to me, compared to the incomparableness of myself and my nature and my attributes, even the nations, these nations that control the world and kind of clash and rise up and then completely determine the direction of someone's life and the impact of someone's life, all of those massive nations, the Roman Empire and the Greeks, and you think of all the different kinds of colossal, epic, new movie coming out called Napoleon, and you get to see how powerful he is in leading France. And here's God saying, well, they're like froth to me. They're like foamy nothing. That's how they compare. Now, what about the idols that these nations are serving? What about the idol gods that are above these nations who they are serving? We learn the incomparable greatness of God. In particular, God is incomparable to idols. This is interesting. In a world where idols are a daily part of their worship, he says, what image can you find to resemble him? Isaiah says, what image is there? Where can you look? What kind of created image can you look at and you say, oh, that resembles God? And virtually every tribe had their own God. And it was tempting for some of the Israelites to give in and serve those idols because they were tangible and they were practical. And in fact, they think of their true God as just one of these gods. It was very tempting to think that the God of the Bible, the Hebrew God, was the same as the God in these nations, one who could be compared to gods of other nations. But God reveals through Isaiah that he's not going to accept any of this. This is nonsense, that he in fact is incomparable to those idols. And he says, who can compare to me, an idol? And then there's this interesting passage in Isaiah where Isaiah, and this, for those of you who are sarcastic, this is another part you can highlight in your Bible and say it justifies your sarcasm. But Isaiah mocks the idols of these foreign nations. And Isaiah says they are made by man. Isaiah says they are totally unable to move. In what sense can they be compared to the creator of all things? They can't move. They're made by man. And then he goes on to mock them even more. And he says, the deluxe idols that you make are kind of like layered with gold, and they have silver chains hanging from them. And a skillful craftsman is careful to use a wood that doesn't rot. He creates so that he can create a durable discount idol to get him out into the hands of all the people. And then he goes on to say, because it would be a terrible thing for one's God to rot. It would be a terrible thing for one's God to topple over. And there's this mocking laughter tone in Isaiah as he says, you have gods that rot, and the craftsmen make them real fancy. But they make a whole bunch of them with wood that doesn't rot so that you can get rid of them at a discount. And Isaiah is careful to say, I want to announce to you that our God doesn't have any, in no way, shape, or form is our God comparable to the idols of the pagan nations, no matter how powerful these nations seem. And he contrasts God's transcendence, his otherness from his creation, and with human frailty. Check this out. God is also incomparable to humans. God sits above the circle of the earth. The people below seem like grasshoppers to him. He spreads out the heavens like a curtain, and he makes his tent from them. So if you think of God putting up his curtains, think of it in terms of he puts up the heavens as his curtains. Human beings look at God, and there is a sense of grasshopperness, right? Now, can you picture a clay? Some of you maybe did this in art class in school. Do you remember when you were given a lump of clay to put on a wheel? Remember that? Some of you remember it because it was probably pretty traumatic if you're not the creative type. Still think about that day when everybody discovered. There's an idea that Paul surfaces in the New Testament where he says the clay that's put on the potter's wheel never gets to say to the potter, why did you make me like this? Or much more crazy, I don't think you exist. The clay cannot look at the potter and say, you don't exist. I've just explained how and why I exist, and in my explanation, you don't exist. It's also ridiculous for a grasshopper to say to the farmer, you are powerless. I'm more powerful than you. And every good farmer just gives that grasshopper a flick, and who knows where it ends up. But there's gazillions more to replace it. But what about the powerful humans, the ones with power to rain down terror? What about the rulers of the earth? What about people who are overseeing kingdoms and empires? What about those people who rule with an iron fist over weaker human beings? God's incomparable to world rulers. He's incomparable. He compares himself to the world's rulers, and this is what he says. This is through Isaiah. Again, he judges the great people of the world, and he brings them all to nothing. They hardly get started, barely taking root, these rulers, and when he blows on them, they wither. The wind carries them off like chaff. So these powerful rulers who sit on thrones and who oppress and destroy and exploit those who are weaker than them, God says compared to them, they haven't even taken root. I just blow on them and they fade away. They just wither away. So human rulers are like withering chaff. But what about the cosmic fire in the heavens? What about stars and planets? What about the things that are so big they're even incomprehensible to us? God says, I'm incomparable to the stars. You can't even compare me to these epic cosmic constellations that are in the sky. God who says, I name the stars, I control the stars. Fascinating. Look at this. Look up into the heavens, Isaiah says. Who created all the stars? Our education system, those stars were created because there was a collision of masses. And those masses eventually gave way to meaningful life. He brings them out like an army, one after another, calling each by name. Imagine, anybody ever imagined the God who created stars knows each one of them and, figuratively speaking, has a name for each one of them? Because of his great power and incomparable strength, not a single one of those stars is unaccounted for. God knows every single one of them. He knows them by name, and he knows where he put them. So what's God revealing to us through Isaiah? What's he saying to us? What's he hoping that we're going to grasp? That comparisons and so much more, physical images of God, are totally inadequate. And they literally limit our understanding of God. In Isaiah 40, verse 25, he says, to whom will you compare me? Who is my equal? Asks the Holy One. How can this be applied to our life? If we think in those terms and we believe what we're just hearing from Isaiah, how does that get applied to our life? One way it applies is this way. Your human words, no matter how creative you are, no matter what you've read, no matter what you've come up with, your words, philosophies, comparisons are too limited to explain the God of the Bible. It's incomparable. He cannot be explained and described by the words that come to our head. And that generates in us a reverence and a worship and an adoration and a willingness to submit, a willingness to worship him above all other things, all other gods, all other people. However much we say we want to explain God, we want to kind of do it in nice, neat ways, especially if you teach kids and you are trying to explain to kids who God is. You want to come up with nice, neat ways to do it and to fit him into our understanding. But here's the reality. God transcends our categories. We don't even have categories to put God into. He is quite literally incomparable. Now, to the Puritans, God was considered incomprehensible. He was considered far beyond the capacity to the human brain to grasp. And they believed that while they could know certain truths about God because he had revealed himself, right? He had revealed himself through the scriptures. He had revealed himself through creation. So you can kind of start to grasp God in some ways through human words and concepts. But essentially they were insufficient. They couldn't really communicate and capture the entirety of God's presence and his existence, and his essence. Now, there's a word for that, and if you have any nerdiness about theology, you might like this word. This is a keeper word, and it's the word ineffability. Ineffability. The ineffability of God. What does that mean? The Puritans would use this concept, and they recognized the limitations of human language to fully describe God's incomparable character. And the inability to use human words to describe his character was actually they would actually use words like infinite, unsearchable. Infinite and unsearchable. And they would do that to convey his greatness. But check this out. The ineffability of God emphasized the humility of human beings in the face of divine, and it encouraged a sense of awe and reverence for the mysterious, incomprehensible nature of God. So the Puritans would say this: the ineffability of God generates in us life-altering worship and awe. In other words, I am small and insignificant, and he is only able to be grasped with words in any way, shape, or form, with words like infinite and unsearchable. And why is that? Because of the ineffability of God, that it's the human response has to be humble in the face of the divine. And what we see is this: it's our words, our philosophies, our comparisons are too limited to explain the God of the Bible. So my approach and your approach to the God of the Bible, the Christian God, should be profoundly humble, profoundly willing to submit ourselves to who he is. And in contrast, secular humanists in our culture who are smart and have fully engaged their intellect that God has created for them, they don't believe in an incomparable God. The main messaging in our culture and the main kind of worldview that's kind of like the golden thread that runs through all of our modern learning and our modern thought, worldviews and philosophies here in the United States is secular humanism. And in fact, they instead emphasize themselves. Our own capacity to reason, our own capacity to implement science and hypothesis and the need for evidence and exploring and inspecting evidence. The secular humanist doesn't believe in an incomparable God. Instead, they elevate moral and ethical decisions. They trust and depend on their own reason, science, and humanism. What might Isaiah say to them today if he could? What might Isaiah say? He might say this in verse 21, "Haven't you heard? Don't you understand? Are you deaf to the words of God, the words he gave before the world began? Are you so ignorant?" It's pretty direct. Are you so ignorant? Secular humanism promotes a non-religious emphasis to approaching life using critical thinking, human rights, social justice, the improvement and betterment of society, and they do that through human effort and cooperation. It's a focus on humans. And they do that rather than relying on divine guidance or any kind of religious doctrines. And the core of secular humanism is rooted in a naturalistic, or we could just say an atheistic perspective, right? That all of that has to happen, can happen, and should happen separate from any real God that's overseeing or instructing anything. And common criticisms of the Christian God that you would hear from a secular humanist is there's a lack of empirical evidence for a divine being, a creator, especially one with a name. And secular humanists often argue that there just isn't enough empirical evidence to support the existence of the Christian God. That the Christian God is essentially just a cultural construct of the Hebrew people. And every culture has their own construct, and they just have different names for their gods, but they're all the same. They instead believe that your life should be really based on reason and evidence, which they see as lacking in any real religious claim. So the secular humanists would also say not just that there's a lack of empirical evidence for the God of the Bible, but also that they're critical of a human reliance, our reliance on faith in a religious belief system. That they often argue that faith discourages critical thinking. And that if you're going to enter into Christianity, you have to leave your brain at the doorstep to do that. And that critical thinking and skepticism is fundamental to the approach that is required to best improve the world. And then there's a third criticism which revolves around scientific accuracy. Critics who are secular humanists would say that the God of the Bible is inconsistent and the things that you see in the Scriptures are inconsistent with what you discover in modern science, and that because of those inconsistencies in the religious texts, you can discount the Christian worldview and you can discount the Bible because of those inconsistencies. Basically, the credibility of religious claims is at stake, is in peril. Now, very kindly, conversations with secular humanists I find intriguing and I find compelling, and I find that there's so much to respect about the trust in the intellect. There really is. Oftentimes, there's parts of my experiences in the world where I want to, if I'm having a conversation with a secular humanist, I want to say something like, does your rational and your skeptical astronomers have trouble explaining some things, right? Like, can your astronomer explain this? This is the Orion Nebula, reportedly the closest kind of nebula to the planet Earth. It's about 1,400 light years away from Earth. So if you do the math real quick, some of you I know already know this, to give you a sense of scale, if you took a spaceship traveling at the speed of light, it would take a little over 4 years to get from here to there. So you catch that, the speed of light, you know how fast light is? Just real quick, if you're not following, it's okay. If you turn on the light, how fast does the light come on once you flip the switch? Pretty quick? That's the speed that you would have to travel for 4 years to get to the closest nebula. Is that pretty wild? So scattered around in this kind of vistascape here, scattered around are thousands of young emerging stars that are starting to kind of, I don't know what the word is, emerge, I guess. And these young stars that are just beginning, get this, they measure up to 40 times the mass of our sun in our solar system. 40 times that mass. Closest nebula. They're stars that are just starting out, they're young, and they big. They very big. They are 40 times the size of our own. So recently, the James Webb, if you have any way to get in touch with or kind of follow along with what the James Webb telescope is discovering, I recommend it. Anybody into the James Webb telescope at all? Follow some of that stuff? It is, you talk about just mind-blowing. Well, the James Webb Space Telescope recently spotted Jupiter-sized planets. You familiar with Jupiter? You've been there? It's very big. Very big. It takes a while to get around the block, so to speak. Well, the James Webb Telescope has discovered Jupiter-sized stars. We can probably call them planets. And they're free-floating in space, disconnected from any star. And there's an intriguing discovery. These objects, these Jupiter-sized planets, appear to be traveling in pairs. And because of the fact that they're traveling in pairs, they've named them jumbos, which is specifically Jupiter mass binary objects. They're paired up, size of Jupiter, and they can't explain why they're not paired up with any stars or they're not revolving around anything of a massive... So, literally in the article that published this information, it says something very specific. It says, astronomers are currently struggling to explain this. And you know that part where remember when I mentioned sarcasm? There's a sarcastic streak in me. And I don't mean it condescendingly, but I do think if you're a secular humanist and you're going to say to a Christian, see, there's no evidence for that, you can't really understand or prove that with empirical data, therefore it or he or God doesn't exist, then I can use the same. Can I use the same logic back? Do I get to say, if astronomers cannot explain this, does this mean this does not exist? Of course it doesn't mean this doesn't exist. What this means is there are things beyond our limited comprehension to understand, and that for some reason there are no words, there's no evidences, there is no science to actually say, hey, I can explain how and why this happened. I want to know how in the world it is that we're supposed to come up with how in the world is our tiny brain supposed to reason, research, and hypothesize how this is possible? First of all, can any of you explain how it's possible for you and me as a human to travel anywhere at the speed of light? I mean, and then to think that out there somewhere is something that we can see with our physical eyes. Does it mean that secular humanists would need faith to believe that this is real? And it is inexplicable to our scientists. But if you categorize this underneath the kind of like the category of God is incomparable, then there's no reason why we can't, with a very, very small leap of faith, believe that there's a creator who knows exactly the name of every star that's in that nebula. And to me, just sincerely, to me, that's more reasonable in explaining something like this than trying to explain it using data and evidence and breaking down the science. In fact, I say this all the time on this topic. I would also ask somebody who's talking about the value of science to either discredit or bring credibility to the discovery of God. Where did science come from and why does it work? Some intelligent designer created it and said, this is going to work and it's always going to work. And you're just going to discover it. You're not going to invent it and use it. More on that in the rest of this series some other time. So you cannot compare, in my opinion, you cannot compare the Christian God to other gods, to earthly rulers, to the sky above or anything that's in the sky. We worship a God who exists in a completely different stratosphere. Now, let me ask you this, on a real practical basis. Do you remember the last time you misplaced your keys? You remember that? Anybody else do this when your keys are missing? You're just like, okay. And you're just touching places that you don't store your keys ever anyway. You're just like, I never put my keys in my pocket, but they've got to be there. I mean, I can't find them. And here we are, collectively human beings, finding a little humor in that we all forget our keys. We don't always know where we put them. Why do we do that? Because our brains are limited. It's just one small example of how we don't have the capacity to take it all in. And here's what I'm asking you to consider. Consider this. Consider the reality that we worship a God who exists, who is way beyond our ability to perceive him, even though he's given us all of our senses to perceive him. The ineffability of God forces us to say, I am small. My heart is humbled. I am in a worship relationship with the Creator. I'm not in a deciding whether or not he exists. Like a clump of clay deciding whether or not the potter exists. That's how Paul writes it in Romans chapter 9. And we have the words of the psalmist who writes about this God, the God of the Bible, the God of creation. And the psalmist helps us, and he compels us to lift our eyes. Listen to this, the psalmist. And when you read the Psalms, this is what happens. The psalmist compels you to lift your eyes off of your own self. And you know what lifting your eyes off of your own self is linked to? Mental and emotional health. And we have the words of the psalmist that help us to lift our eyes off of ourselves and help us to pray and help us to worship our God. Here's how he writes this. For the Lord has chosen Israel for his own special treasure. I know the greatness of the Lord, that our Lord is greater than any other God. The Lord does whatever pleases him, and he does it throughout all heaven and all earth, and on the seas and in their depths. Your name, O Lord, endures forever. Your fame, O Lord, is known to every generation. Whether we help that happen or not, God reveals himself to every generation, and he did to the Hebrew people through the prophet Isaiah. And even today, in our modern world, he's revealing himself to us through the prophet Isaiah. And what are we learning? That God is incomparable. And that when we kind of begin to grasp that, our heart softens and it melts, and we begin to submit our lives to that God, because that God, compared to us, generates so much humility, adoration, reverence, and awe. And all of us could use a little more of that in our life and bring spiritual maturity and responsiveness and obedience out of that position of our hearts. Would you pray with me? Father, thank you today for revealing yourself through Isaiah. Help us to hear your voice today, urging us to think less of ourselves and more of you. Help us to hear your voice today, God, urging us to make more of you and less of ourselves. God, help us to sense your voice today saying, you can surrender, you can open your hands, you can open your heart, and you can lay it all down before me, because I am a God of the universe, unsearchable and infinite. Father, I pray that you'd help us just today to learn the significance of lifting our eyes off of ourselves. That would we find ourselves in pursuit of you, that we would find ourselves on a journey full of joy in discovering your attributes, immersing ourselves in your character and your presence. And we thank you that through all of that, somehow you have made yourself known to us. Even though the earth is like a speck of sand on your fingertip, you have still made yourself known to us. You've created us, that you love us, that you have plans for us to thrive and flourish in knowing and being known by Jesus. And we thank you today, God, that you know us by name, every hair on our head, that you know the number, you know how many days that we have, that you knit us together in our mother's womb, and that you have extraordinary, dynamic relationship planned for each one of us. If we could lift our eyes to heaven and see the God who is incomparable, God, help us to do it today together. We ask this in Jesus' strong name, the one who is the exact image, the perfect shining brightness of your glory, Jesus. We pray in his great name together. Amen. Would you stand? We're going to sing of God's beauty and greatness together.